The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
In 2013, China launched its ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. The goal was to build a network of overland and maritime trade routes, linking China with Asia, Europe, and Africa. A great fanfare greeted the project when it began. Over $1 trillion were earmarked to boost economic development and plug infrastructure gaps, especially across the developing world. To discuss these and related issues, join our live debate, bringing your questions, arguments and challenges. The event will broadcast live on all social media platforms of the Democracy Forum, on Thursday 25th of August 2022, 2 to 4 p.m. UK time.
Hello and welcome wherever you are in the world to this Democracy Forum debate on a topic that has been impacting many of our lives in recent years, the Belt and Road Initiative. That imagination capturing Chinese vision to step in where Western democracies had not and build the roads, bridges, ports and infrastructure that so many countries needed in order to develop. What a dream that was then, it seemed. We were embracing an unassailable golden era with China. But what is unfolding now from Sri Lanka to Nicaragua to the Solomon Islands to Poland is more complicated, more acrimonious, more political, and more drowned in debt and social unrest. Or is it? To unravel the Belt and Road Initiative for us, we have a brilliant panel. Claire Chu, Ingrid de Hoog, Una Alexandra, Bērziņa-Čerenkova, and Richard Ghiasy. Harsh Pant, who was to have joined us, has gone down, unfortunately, with an illness. Speedy recovery, and I'll be asking the panelists to help fill in his area, which was to be South Asia and the Indian Ocean. Our debate will be summed up by the chair of the Democracy Forum, Barry Gardner, MP, a long-time expert on global issues, particularly in Asia. But first, we go to the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, to give us the canvas and the background on which we are to debate. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Humphrey. Announced in 2013 in support of China's ambitious gambit for leadership of the Global South, the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, now is clearly facing a reappraisal. In welcoming you to the webinar today, I extend my thanks to the team at the Democracy Forum for arranging this important event and for inviting such an eminent group of panelists to answer the question, has the Belt and Road Initiative lost its luster? And critically, to examine the prevailing underlying issues. We're very grateful that each has agreed to share their expertise. And as ever, I reserve my gratitude to Humphrey Hawksley for accepting the role of moderator. There is little doubt that during its lifetime, the BRI has become the largest transnational infrastructure program ever undertaken by a single country, and has earned China the accolade as the world's foremost bilateral lender. A cumulative engagement amounting to $923 billion, including $561 billion in construction contracts and $371 billion in investments. Research published last year by the College of William and Mary in the United States indicates that in the field of international development finance, China now outspends the United States and other major powers on a 2-to-1 basis or more. In recent years, however, evidence is mounting to show that China is actually facing its first overseas debt crisis as a consequence of the projects it has funded and the covenant of the countries it has accumulated as debtors. Analysis published recently by the Rhodium Group reveals that, I quote, loans issued in recent years are turning bad at an unprecedented rate. And indeed, in the last 2 years alone, Chinese overseas loans requiring negotiation have soared in value by threefold to reach $52 billion. Indeed, Rhodium estimates that the total value of loans under renegotiation has reached $118 billion, or 16% of the total extended. And research into the covenant of China's borrowers published in April this year by the Center for Economic Policy Research indicates alarmingly that at least 60% of the loans are given to countries in financial distress, compared to only 5%, before the BRI was launched. There is also abundant evidence to show that many of the programs supported by the BRI are facing major implementation problems. Some 35% of projects have been assessed as such by the Aid Data Lab, which has published research to indicate that Chinese state institutions are facing loan defaults on a very challenging scale from countries such as Pakistan, Belarus, Egypt, Mongolia, Turkey, and Sri Lanka. A leading article published by the Financial Times last month suggests that the genesis of the BRI has now been undermined by a cocktail of systemic flaws, including a general lack of transparency, insufficient risk management, and the participation of many of the world's riskiest debtor nations. Commenting on the consequences of China's lending to the world's poorest countries, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz claimed at a panel discussion in Stuttgart in May this year that the next major debt crisis in the global south will stem from loans that China has granted worldwide. A report published by the World Bank in June suggests that developing countries may be heading towards a debt crisis on a scale last seen in the 1980s. I quote, "It will be a perfect storm for the global economy," predicted Ayaan Kos, head of the World Bank's forecasting unit. And referring to the problems emanating from the steady accumulation of the BRI's lending errors, Matthew Mingay, senior researcher at Rhodium, commented recently, I quote, "We are at a major pivot right now. The scale of this widespread debt pressure is something that China has never faced before, and it is having to reinvent BRI on the fly." And writing in the Financial Times yesterday, the Chatham House researcher Yu Jie poses the question, I quote, "Beijing's spending spree must come to an end as it grapples with its own economic woes. Can it tighten its belt while also maintaining close relations with the developing world?" Indeed, this dilemma is fast turning into China's biggest challenge of economic statecraft. She writes, I quote, "The ultimate test is whether Beijing can engage with developing countries beyond relationships built on financial resources and diplomatic capital. Showering cash on these places is not always guaranteed to win hearts and minds. Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch this webinar today. And if you have any questions or points, please direct them to the panel through Humphrey.
Thank you, Charles. That's a fascinating backdrop. I mean, the point that you mentioned, the World Bank, I think, suggesting that developing countries may be heading towards a debt crisis on a scale last seen in the 1980s. That debt crisis was, of course, when the West was doing the lending. And I remember, reporting on those issues. And now it seems that it's China doing it. Our first panelist is Claire Chu, a senior analyst on China for the RWR Advisory Group, which is now part of Jane's, that open source defense intelligence magazine and website. Claire is going to spark the debate, I think, by telling us that despite the headlines of debt and collapsed contracts, the Belt and Road Initiative has served its intended purpose and continues to evolve. Claire Chu, share with us what you know.
Great. Thank you, Humphrey, and thank you for having me. You can hear me all right? Great.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. So just as a preface, I'm not saying that I dispute the systemic flaws, and I won't be getting into the initiative's various challenges. There are problems regarding implementation delays, governance, corruption, financial mismanagement, so on and so forth. But I will be speaking on the general direction of the Belt and Road Initiative and what we might see in the future and where it's going. The Belt and Road today, as we know it, when you think of the Belt and Road, you're thinking of the roads and the highways and the ports. It's achieved a lot of its intended purpose, and it's now evolving, not only functionally, but also rhetorically. So until now, it served as a platform to advance China's broader economic, industrial, foreign policy objectives, as well as national security objectives increasingly. So at this point, 2022, roads have been built. We have the highways, port terminals, other multimodal infrastructure. We have Chinese personnel and assets have been deployed overseas. In many areas, they've established a long-term presence. Chinese companies have entered new markets. They've expanded their global presence with proliferation of not only products and services, but also standards, norms, and education. And key bilateral relationships have been developed and strengthened with countries that are not allies, but countries that could become allies or partners or friendly nations to China in the future. With these milestones having been achieved, the coming years will see less ribbon cutting, fewer new debt-driven projects, and a greater emphasis on interconnection and outputs. So China will be looking to digitize and get projects smarter on the grid. China will be looking to connect these projects further, connect projects, networks, and pipelines through sub-regional, regional, international, intercontinental means. China will seek to secure its overseas assets through international law enforcement, military engagement, ensure the sustainability and the profitability of projects through local education, training, other upskilling initiatives, elevate national technical standards to international standards, and then ultimately advance Chinese strategic power through structural power through multilateral leadership and alternative global governance institutions. So these new targets are what underpin two of the new initiatives that China has introduced within the past year, the Global Development Initiative, GDI, and the Global Security Initiative, GSI. And I'll get to both of those shortly. So again, back to the Belt and Road on its own. It's developed in phases. And I think a good way to understand this type of evolution is to look at CPEC, the China and Pakistan Economic Corridor. So as a flagship BRI project, CPEC it's not meant to be static. And you can see the decline in, there are a lot of problems that plague CPEC specifically, but the decline in large key projects doesn't necessarily mean the initiative itself is fading away. So CPEC was originally conceived as three consecutive 5-year phases. The first phase during 2013 was intended to build up internal infrastructure. So it was dominated by government to government or government to business cooperation in fields like roads, highways, and energy infrastructure. The second phase that started in 2019 focused on digital cooperation, trade promotion, agricultural, socioeconomic development, and essentially building up the backbone for future growth. And that second phase revolved around the private sector. So we saw industrialization as a driving force, cooperation with science and technology, agriculture, and also focus on more interconnected projects like special economic zones as a way to expedite industrialization and also consolidate a lot of these other manufacturing objectives and innovation objectives as well. And it should be noted that there are now more actors involved in CPEC as the entrepreneurship of individual government ministries, provincial leaders, and other groups are now coming in. So again, what we're seeing 2019-2022 in CPEC is very, very different from a very simple, this is China Communications Construction Group or China Harbor Engineering Group going in 2013-2014. And so as we're moving forward, the Belt and Road, which is never really precisely defined by China State Council, it has served as a bit of a catch-all phrase to promote China's overseas economic activities. And so the financing models have evolved, commercial actors have evolved, but the Belt and Road itself is not conceptually novel. And it has been highly effective for branding, has been a promotional campaign, distribution network, and a tool for diplomatic signaling. We have seen, I think, as the premise of this discussion, that the Belt and Road may be fading a bit in visibility. After the second Belt and Road Forum was held in Beijing in April 2019, the third one was slated for, I think, also spring of 2020, interrupted due to COVID, and just hasn't happened. There really hasn't been a reason articulated because China has moved forward with various other conferences and forums through virtual and hybrid formats, but just hasn't brought back the Belt and Road Forum. And why is that? We're not sure, but this is not necessarily a new phenomenon. We've seen Chinese government introduce other initiatives to communicate high-level coordination policy objectives, and sometimes these initiatives seem to go away where they no longer serve the intended publicity purpose, but doesn't mean that they actually cease to exist. And a good example is China's Made in China 2025 initiative. It was announced 2025, National Strategic Plan, industrial policy. Some of you may be familiar with it. And the goals included achieving independence from foreign suppliers. It included building up the semiconductor industry, included targeting key industries like robotics and information technology. And it was met with swift backlash from the US, Europe, and many other countries. In the US, there are headlines like, is Made in China 2025 a threat to global trade? The word threat was used a lot. And in response, this initiative was de-emphasized in Chinese government and other official communications, but only in name. The program remains in place, and the whole government approach to Chinese indigenous innovation has actually been rapidly developing and somewhat successful, depending on your definition of successful, but despite decreased global messaging visibility. So as these criticisms about debt trap diplomacy and predatory lending practices continue to plague Belt and Road, around the world, really, and increasingly over the past 2 years, it doesn't really tell whether or not that tells a full story. Chinese development finance, we are starting to see less hype over that Belt and Road as a concept, but that doesn't, again, mean that it's gone away, that the actors have gone away, or that the objectives have necessarily changed. We have seen the emergence of a lot of rhetorical extensions of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, for example, digital Silk Road, health Silk Road, space Silk Road, green Silk Road, and I'm sure there are more too. And through these different extensions, China has leveraged the BRI brand, as well as BRI transportation networks and market presence and corporate networks to promote strategic objectives and to export leadership in different fields. And through these extensions, the BRI is effectively seeking to, as a distribution network for Chinese technical standards, for things like vaccine diplomacy, space diplomacy, other policies and ideas, leadership roles in multilateral organizations, institutions. And so what's next? There's the Global Development Initiative that Xi Jinping announced in September 2021. And what I think is interesting is this was announced during a virtual address to the UN General Assembly, which is in contrast to when the Belt and Road was announced in 2013 in Kazakhstan during a high-level meeting, and also in Indonesia in a high-level meeting. So now China the platform has really changed. They are announcing these initiatives with the backing of these multilateral organizations. They're announcing the GDI, Global Development Initiative, with the backing of the UN Secretary General. And yes, the comments. And notably, it's these these initiatives like GDI are being characterized not only as a Chinese initiative, but also as complementary to initiatives around the world. So when GDI was introduced, it was characterized as synergetic with the Belt and Road, but also with various Vision, Middle East objectives and sustainable development goals for the UN. And the idea is that the GDI, it's separate from the Belt and Road, but it really is not that different. It's cropped up already in joint statements between China and other countries. That's come up in readouts following Chinese high-level meetings. And it really ties into a lot of the other objectives that China has regionally, internationally, and elevates them to, again, a multilateral stage. And just to fast forward a little bit, running low on time, And the Global Security Initiative was announced more recently in April 2022 during Xi Jinping's keynote speech at the Boao Forum for Asia. And so this represents China's efforts to move beyond being a responsible stakeholder and to embrace a newly self-assigned role as a responsible major country. And Xi Jinping has explicitly stated that security is a precondition for development. And so the Global Security Initiative is therefore inextricably linked to the Global Development Initiative, which is supposed to be synergetic with the Belt and Road Initiative. And we can look past over the past year and observe several events, such as the recent security pact, the China's Solomon Islands. We can look at some of the new recent private security deployments to overseas in Africa, naval activity that has been suspected in Cambodia. And it really signals a strong shift towards this new initiative, where not only is China partnering with foreign militaries, for example, in Pakistan, where there's a special division to guard Belt and Road projects, but also sending more private security companies overseas in coordination with Chinese nationals and assets. And many of these are armed. Many of these do have some intelligence gathering purposes. And these private security groups also have, they are going overseas for commercial purposes, but ultimately can serve state objectives due to the nature of, really the nature of their conception, and also just due to the resources they have available. So I'm running pretty low on time, but Belt and Road going forward is also sustainable because of the amount of upskilling that China has dedicated to its projects. That comes in the form of education partnerships between Chinese universities and foreign universities with industry focuses. That could be techno-vocational education and training, Luban workshops that China has launched in countries, at least over 24 countries overseas, where Chinese companies are training local workforces to work on Chinese projects. In Pattaya, Thailand, there is a Luban workshop on high-speed rail where the graduates will be working the Chinese high-speed rail. Similarly, China is actively building out this global network of projects too, so that even when the Chinese workers leave, even when the companies leave, they can still operate and access from overseas, and local workers can continue them for posterity. So in conclusion, and I think coming up in my time once again, but in conclusion, the Belt and Road isn't necessarily declining. The Belt and Road isn't necessarily going away. The branding might be changing, the purpose and objectives may be evolving, but we're seeing the Belt and Road conceptually become more entrenched globally. And we're seeing the diminished messaging actually as a sign of, the spread in the global presence, that China doesn't need the marketing, doesn't need the publicity anymore for the Belt and Road. It's already there.
Thank you for that. That is completely fascinating, because it does sort of give us a perspective that we don't see in the headlines in the Western press that is coming through all the time. If you read it over the past month or so, you would think that it had come to a halt with all sorts of scandals and acrimony attached. Can you just put in perspective for me that thought that I had at the beginning about the 1980s developing world debt, when the West was basically in charge of all that building and that? How do those two situations compare?
I'm not sure if I can speak to that comparison, but I do think that China is in a position where the infrastructure is built overseas, especially when it comes to telecommunications and a lot of the physical infrastructure, it can't really be replaced. So regardless of the debt situation, there's an idea it'll sort itself out. These countries are still going to go to China. Rip and replace is incredibly expensive. And so it's a very long-term sort of investment, regardless of financial distress.
And we're hearing a lot and reading a lot about sort of the Western like-minded nations putting together coalitions to face up to the Belt and Road challenge, the Japan, India, and things like that. What's actually happening there?
I think part of what we're seeing is, yes, the US is going in and dedicating $100 million to investing in a certain region, but then China is going and dedicating 3 times as much. Plus they're bringing in their best people, they're rolling out their red carpet, they're building schools, they're donating laptops, and then they're giving full scholarships for all the village's children to go back to China. It's hard to compete with an offer like that when they're not just coming in with, here's a project or here's a grant. They're saying, this is what your future could be. This is what your young people could be for the next generation. Let us help.
That's great. Can I put a question to you that's come in from Rimjin Sud, who says, China claims that the BRI originated in China, but belongs to the world. Take that concept. How far is that true?
I think it is important to remember that the Belt and Road originated in China, and that these other initiatives like GDI and GSI also originate from China, because as much as China wants to or seeks to or is effective in painting these as global initiatives, ultimately the top-down leadership, the policy objectives are being set in Beijing, and ultimately a lot of the stakeholders, including financial stakeholders, are in Beijing. So I think it's true in terms of the physical presence, but ultimately strategically it rests in Beijing's hands.
Yeah, it is, because I mean, you know, I think a lot of us have been to African countries, Asian countries, Latin America, where you're suddenly down a road that's been built by the Chinese and it hadn't been built before. But thank you so much there, Claire Chu. Stay with us. Our next panelist is Ingrid de Hoog, China Strategy Advisor at the Netherlands Institute of International Relations. She's been a diplomat and has studied at Shanghai's Fudan University. And she's going to expand this theme, actually. She's looking at how the Belt and Road Initiative is not just about ports and roads and airports and that sort of thing, but it also encompasses science, technology, and higher education. Ingrid, tell us what you know.
Thank you very much. And actually, it ties to a few things that Claire had just mentioned. So I think it's a nice follow-up. Indeed, I would like to discuss a less well-known, maybe also less prominent, but certainly not irrelevant element of the BRI, namely the nexus that China is building between science and technology policies, higher education policies, and the BRI. Sometimes this is referred to as the academic Silk Road, the educational Silk Road, and other Silk Road names. President Xi Jinping has called this a key project. And why then is this relevant? Well, it is relevant because the strengthening of this nexus between BRI and science and technology is key to realizing the broader goals of the BRI. The economic goals, no economic growth without advances in science and technology and without training people. Minister of Science and Technology has said, for example, that the Belt and Road should become a boulevard for innovation. But it also serves political goals, namely furthering China's model for global governance. The model is called Building a Community of Shared Future for Mankind, and this is also explicitly one of the goals of the Belt and Road Initiative. The connection between the two, the agendas for science and technology and the BRI agenda are symbiotic. So both sides actually are benefiting from this endeavor. The government made a lot of policies, action plans, budgets, and is working very hard to implement these policies. I already said numerous policies, I think a few dozens. The most important one is a 2016 action plan, and that's also what my focus for today is. The plan consists of 3 broad goals of this nexus, building this nexus. The first one is strengthening science and technology collaboration, and this is really about research, scientific research collaboration. It's about creation of technological innovation platforms, laboratories, industrial technology research institutes, scientific exchanges, sharing of resources, and so on. This is the biggest challenge, actually, of this nexus. And so far, as we will see in a minute, it hasn't been that successful. The second one has been far more successful, is the cultivation and training of talents. So universities in China, vocational schools, technical research institutes are encouraged to establish colleges, training centers, and training programs in BRI countries. And they are called upon in particular to do this in collaboration with China's high-speed railroad and telecommunication companies, something Claire also already mentioned. And this way, the collaboration will contribute directly to meeting the infrastructure needs in these countries, but also to building the digital Silk Road, also a very important element of the BRI. And indeed, we do see there are many examples. The Lupan workshops are just one of these examples that these programs are indeed being established. I'll give some figures later. Then the third element is deepening the understanding of China and Chinese policies abroad in BRI countries. So BRI in this sense is used very explicitly, or this nexus very explicitly, as a public diplomacy or soft power vehicle. In this respect, the Confucius Institutes abroad are explicitly mentioned, and whereas in the Western world, in America, Canada, Europe, many Confucius Institutes are being closed. In Asia, for example, but also in Africa, the institutes are flourishing. Thailand, for example, has established a Maritime Silk Road Confucius Institute, which is devoted specifically to supporting the BRI. What is the impact so far? Of course, these conclusions are premature. This is just phase one. I would also like to repeat that. BRI is a long-term vision, a long-term strategic vision. Implementation of these policies have just been 4 or 5 years, and then COVID struck. So they are a bit premature, but still we can already see a few trends. Why it is also a bit difficult is that there's no full information available, no data sets, and we also see that a lot of labeling is taking place. This is not just in science and technology. I think that's for the whole BRI, that sometimes funds that were already available are suddenly labeled BRI funds. So it's sometimes difficult to see which are the new and extra funds specifically dedicated for the BRI. If we look at the empirical evidence, we could, for example, ask ourselves, do BRI countries have relatively benefited extra from this nexus with science? And you could look, for example, at co-publications. There has been a study that looked at co-publications in BRI countries in Central and Eastern Europe in the 17+1 group, formerly the 17+1 group, now it's 14+1. And there we see actually no significant results. And why is that the case? Probably because most BRI countries are not the top countries in science and technology, so the countries that have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. So within this framework, high-level science, a very strategic science research on quantum technology, AI, is not taking place in many of these BRI countries. Then if we look at staff and student mobility, we could say there may be a small impact of these policies. So there is a small rise, relative rise of the percentage of scholarship-sponsored students going to China coming from BRI countries. So that growth is higher than the overall growth of incoming students into China. Of course, these figures are pre-COVID. Right now, there is no inward mobility to China possible. If we look at outgoing mobility of scientists, of students, we also see a slightly higher percentage of growth among the outgoing mobility to BRI countries. If you can really attribute this to these BRI policies, that's of course very difficult because many of the BRI countries are developing themselves. Maybe these figures would have grown anyway. But nevertheless, if you want to take an optimistic view, you could say there may be a correlation there. By the way, what is important to realize that 65% of the incoming students in China were already from BRI countries. So this is quite a large group. If we look at training and program labs, we also do see results. Ministry of Education has reported on all the results. I will not mention all the figures, but there have been a lot of personnel trained. There have been more than 100,000 students trained in these workshops, in these technical training workshops. There have been laboratories built in BRI countries and so on. So there is some positive impact visible there. Now, what do these findings mean then, coming to a conclusion? What are the broader implications? We do see that the research and educational traffic and the export of China's educational institution to BRI country has grown. And many of these countries have less developed academic systems, and they are really benefiting from these programs. Furthermore, we also see that what is driving students in these countries to go to China to study is that at home there is no financing and there's a lack of places at domestic universities. So Chinese scholarships are very welcome, and the availability of the possibility to study in China is also very welcome. So this is attracting big groups. And these programs, of course, helps to China to build a growing pool of well-trained talents. And these talents not only study, but they will also work in BRI projects in China, but maybe also back home in their own countries. So they really contribute to China's implementation of BRI infrastructural, digital, and other projects in these countries. What we also could see as a possible wider implication for the future is that China may be able to train increasingly young talents from across the globe, especially from the global south, who may all develop strong ties to China, strong ties to BRI projects. And this will be an enormous asset. And the other side of the medal is that these young people, young talents, are not trained by countries in the rest of the world, are not trained in Europe, or may not be trained in the US. And in a time that there is already a demand for talented students, especially in the hard sciences, and where there's already a shortage of skilled laborers in these areas, this may really be a very important issue for the future. There's also another risk, namely that these countries become increasingly dependent on China for educating their younger generations. And this may also reduce the room for these countries for making policy decisions that counter Chinese interests, and not only in bilateral context, but also in multilateral context. Another, let's say, result of this whole endeavor is that China is positioning itself more and more as a country that's not only seeking knowledge abroad, especially in Europe and in the US, but that is also exporting knowledge, that's sharing knowledge, and that's investing in global programs to develop knowledge, which is of course very positive for China. Let me come to a final conclusion and look ahead a little bit. It's very difficult to see in what way this will develop. On the one hand, we have still the impact of COVID-19 travel restrictions into China. There is the polarization in the world between countries supporting China, countries becoming more and more critical about China. There is a politicization of science and technology issues going on. There's a growing attention for the risks that are involved in science collaboration with China, a growing apprehension of the BRI as a whole. So these are all challenges for China to overcome. But of course, this is not a whole story. And like Claire said, this is just phase one of a very long-term plan. And China is now connecting, also in the area of science, their goals to the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And that may take away also a little bit of the negative connotation that the BRI has by now in many countries. So this may be a very fruitful new direction into developing this nexus. So the impact may not yet be that big, but the traffic, the research, educational traffic between BRI countries and China is growing, and China keeps working and improving the strategy. And last but not least, it is supported by funding. And that is, of course, a very important pull factor. So I'm still optimistic, or well, it's not optimistic. I still expect actually to see a further growth of collaboration in this area, and the BRI being successful, at least in the global south, in Southeast Asia, in Africa. and in Latin America in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid. That's our first two speakers telling us, I think, very much that the Belt and Road Initiative has not run out of steam. Can I just clarify with you the point that you made there, that we in Britain and I think in America, we're closing down the Confucius Institutes, telling universities to be suspect and not take funding from China. All of that sort of stuff is going on. Whereas in the developing world or global south or whatever you want to call it, these educational institutions are booming, and generations and tens of millions of engineers and doctors and scientists are going to be coming out of there over the next 20 or 30 years, having been trained and educated by this Chinese initiative.
That's a possibility. And yes, indeed, in many countries, these institutes and programs are really flourishing. They are very welcome in these countries. Many people in these countries take a different view on China, and I wouldn't say millions. But we do see, China says more than 100,000. That was in 2019. So if China continues these programs, I do think they could be successful in that area, and that they may draw a lot of talented potential students to them, and then these people will not be coming to the rest of the world. Whereas there's a shortage in Europe, in the US.
It's a sort of educational decoupling in a way. Do you think the West is being a little bit hasty in the way that it suddenly sort of slammed down the doors after a few years ago embracing the golden era?
I think a rethink of our relationship with China is very necessary, and I think we should become less dependent on China and strengthen our own development. And a full decoupling is not possible and will not happen. And even if you look at the US, who is investing, who is propagating a decoupling with China, for example, in the area of science and technology, you see the number of co-publications growing very rapidly. You see the foreign direct investment from the US in China still growing. Really? There is, on the one hand, there is what is being said by politicians, and then there's what's happening on the ground. So it also shows that decoupling is not possible, also with the complicated value change that exists.
Just before I let you go, I'd like to put to you a question from Mongza Lee, which I think you've answered, but I'll put it anyway and give us another answer. Has the BRI extended China's diplomatic reach and soft power? If so, how?
Well, there's not one answer to this. So I think in, let's say, Europe, US, Canada, Australia, Japan, no. But in many other parts of the world, yes. So Middle Eastern region, and many countries in Asia, not all countries, many countries in Africa, many countries in Latin America. This is at the moment certainly the case. And that's also reflected, for example, in opinion polls being conducted by the US, where you see that the outlook on China, the view on China is still quite positive. Majorities in these countries are positive about China and say that collaboration with China is beneficial to their country.
Okay, thank you for that. Stay with us. I have to tell everybody that last Richard Ghiasy from the Leiden Asia Institute, who was going to talk to us about the security perspective on China's vision of Asian security, cannot get through to us on his internet connection. He's continuing to try, but he thinks it's very doubtful. So we're going to have a much longer time for question and answer, and I'm going to be asking some of the panelists to talk about those issues that aren't being covered by our now two missing panelists. And next, but last, we go to Alexandra Bērziņa-Čerenkova, who is in Latvia. That's a Baltic state targeted by the BRI and also targeted, I think, by authoritarian Russia.
Humphrey?
Hello, yes, we can hear you. I'm
Hi,
introducing
wonderful. Excellent. I was just telling everyone at home to be quiet from this moment on.
Right, to be quiet. And I'm saying that you're in Latvia. You're the head of the Asia program at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs and a member of CHERN, CHERN. That's a European think tank network on China. And you've also studied at the Fudan University in Shanghai. You're going to be talking to us about the European perspective of the BRI, and also let us know what the Ukraine war and Russia has got to do with any of that. So, Una, welcome from Latvia and share your knowledge.
Thank you, and it's an honor and wonderful to follow such excellent insights. And it's a pity that Richard cannot join us because, of course, his perspective would have been very valuable.
We might get him back. I'm going to message him now and see if we can get him.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
So the question that you asked in this exercise that you put for us to answer, has the Belt and Road Initiative has lost its luster as a whole, is a trick question within itself, right? And what I want to argue is that it has failed and it has not achieved some objectives in some regions, including I would say EU countries, but it is a parceled initiative and it is module based. And I think I'm falling also back on what Claire and Ingrid have already said about this. So we cannot really equate a failure of one of these parcels, one of these modules with a grander initiative, or rather its future. So first of all, so this is what I want to do today, is to take this European perspective and comment on the issues that Belt and Road has encountered here. And I will be focusing on the Nordic Baltic region, but also here and there our perspective coincides with also the Visegrad, some of the Visegrad states. So let me first of all give you a bit of a background. So our region is interesting. Why? Because at first, Belt and Road was not the first China's multilateral vision that we were invited into or subjected to, whichever way you want to put it. The first was, in fact, 16+1. And that started coming into the region from 2012, then at first as these 12 friendly initiatives for countries of Central and Eastern Europe, stretching across from Tallinn down to Tirana, and just kind of trying, from Beijing's perspective, trying to find some sort of cooperation with the countries of sort of that are not exactly Western Europe in their view, but are not also necessarily directly in Russia's field of interest. So countries, it's not about the countries that were invited into this initiative, into this format, but it's about the ones who weren't. Ukraine wasn't there, Belarus wasn't there, and Moldova wasn't there. So that tells you about how mindful China was of Russia's reaction to this. And actually, the Russian refrain is something that I will keep coming back to, because I think it has, the China-Russia angle has a lot to do with how China's multilateral initiatives have developed or kind of run into issues in the region. So, and in that time, it was kind of the idea rang back to what later on was also presented as Belt and Road. So Belt and Road blueprint after 2015 was kind of laid on top of this 16+1, and Chinese diplomats more and more started speaking about 16+1 and BRI, or just omitting 16+1 altogether, speaking about, infrastructure loans that the region didn't need because it had EU structural funds. Also logistics, so kind of transit, increasing, fighting the trade imbalance, that kind of agenda. But so Belt and Road started coming in as this other keyword, and all Baltic states signed Belt and Road memoranda in 2016. And I would like to challenge a little bit the fact that the criticism that the Belt and Road is facing are new. In fact, they are not new. They were there from stage one. If anything, China had tried to adapt and to troubleshoot because this criticism that actually they're throwing loans our way, whereas the loans that we don't need, but which is kind of a South-South model that China had developed before. But what we were interested then as a region would be, something that Western Europe has with China. So, develop trade, high value added cooperation, all that stuff before the geopolitical turn of 2018, 2019. Sorry, if you hear snoring, it's my dog. And against this backdrop, China really tried to adapt and tried to say that this is, in fact, the loans were kind of cast into the background a little bit. And instead of that, they tried to talk about trade routes. But the main issue of Belt and Road in the region was that it hinged upon Belarus, upon landlocked Belarus that China had established cooperation with bilaterally in the framework of the Great Stone. And Great Stone was an industrial park. And the idea was, okay, so the most realistic for the region is that you guys join in as these logistic partners for this park. But the park was not being built in the speed that it was. It failed to provide the one interesting kind of catch that the region wanted, basically bringing together the West and the rest. So kind of doing doing this China plus West model, plus also these ideas of connectivity, and that had failed. Microsoft was advertised as one of the companies that would create its business in the Great Stone. So that kind of tells you about the image message that was being cast. So this kind of everybody together project. And of course, after August 2020, any cooperation with Belarus in the region on the EU side became impossible after the unrest and the election. So Belt and Road already then became kind of had lost, using your phrase, lost its luster in the region. And of course, on top of that came Russia's war in Ukraine. And China's position, which is, of course, ambiguous, which is, of course, doesn't go all the way into the Russian worldview, but is still too close for comfort to the Russian one. So I did bring 16+1 into this. And 16+1 started, or 17+1, as it was shortly known, began shaking at the foundation for the very same reasons already, starting from 2020 with the missed foras and political and kind of a lack of political participation on the side of some countries, including the Baltic countries, then the Lithuanian withdrawal or exit from the format in 2021, followed by the two other Baltic countries just recently. So signifying that also this little brother of Belt and Road in the region, 16+1, is falling apart, something that Ingrid made reference to earlier. So what that brings me to the future of Belt and Road in my region, and maybe in the Nordic Baltic region in general, because as we talk with the Nordic Baltic colleagues, we see a lot of similarities here. So, which is interesting because that on one hand, we're told that China approaches Central and Eastern Europe differently, but we see that in Northeastern Europe, we see kind of a mix of the models of China's approach to Northern Europe and to Central Europe. So, in contrast to initial goals, Belt and Road has not been able to bring kind of the West in, right? We remember what a big deal was Italy signing the memorandum and that kind of thing. So this is kind of for the West and the rest for everyone. That did not work. It is increasingly being perceived as a trademark initiative of and for the rest. And so this is where I want to say that Claire has made an extremely important point on Global Development Initiative and Global Security Initiative. And I want to second that point, saying that we also see it here in the region. Belt and Road mentions have decreased. And I do take Claire's point that maybe it's just China's not investing into image anymore. It's just because these things are working, but definitely not in this region. It's not working. And the mentions have decreased. At the same time, we see Chinese ambassadors in the region almost simultaneously publish op-eds on the Global Development Initiative and Global Security Initiative, kind of marketing it as this new approach that the countries should take. And so that will continue. So in my opinion, we will see an increase in these keywords in the region, especially the Global Development Initiative, because the Global Security Initiative does sound problematic here, right, geopolitically, but the development agenda, why not? And then the other thing that we will see in the region is to also echo Ingrid's point about the softer agenda. And that is also something that we see that has changed in the communication of Chinese diplomats in the region, is that it's about culture, it's about language, it's about tourism, it's about winter sports. And it is about a mission of Belt and Road, or kind of just trying to circumvent it as a keyword, but trying to shape these messages into a bilateral setting. So whether Belt and Road is coming back to our neck of the woods is unlikely in the short-term perspective. I do not see that happening. Whether that means that Belt and Road has lost its luster or has become irrelevant globally, no. Like I said, it is a module-based initiative. And I think a very good example of how it works is how China is now approaching, after the beginning of Russia's war in Ukraine, how China is approaching the Caspian Sea corridor. And we've seen presentations by our Chinese colleagues that do have maps that show, so this is the Caspian Sea, and this is how things are happening right now. It's kind of the reorientation of the corridors. And also our Kazakh colleagues have made a point of this, that, well, Belt and Road is very much alive and kicking in our region, in their region, in Central Asia, rather. So the module-based framework makes Belt and Road resilient. That is my final point. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That was it sort of builds on what is emerging here is that I call it decoupling, but this separation. So what you're arguing, and correct me if I've read it wrong, is that the Belt and Road Initiative has run out of steam in Europe, but
I would say in European Union.
In European Union, okay, but in Latvia.
Absolutely, including in Latvia.
Including in Latvia, and particularly in Lithuania. I wanted to talk about that because you're right next door to them. And this was only the tiny little way that they were describing Taiwan. It was an upgrading of the diplomatic status. But the reaction from China was enormous, attempting to cripple Lithuania's economy, essentially, with sanctions. How much was Europe, the European Union, behind that? And to what extent was that a sort of trigger that said, no, we can't have this Belt and Road stuff anymore?
I would say that, if anything, Brussels was taken aback by Lithuania's position on Taiwan and was perhaps behind closed doors not very happy with it, and calling Lithuanians too much of transatlanticists for their own good. But at the same time, so let me just clarify here. So Lithuanian foreign policy vis-a-vis China is actually a two-stepped, what we saw was a two-step process. And the first step of which was not showing up and telling about it, not showing up to 17+1 anymore and telling about it, or what we could call a withdrawal. But we cannot withdraw from something we're not really a part of, right? But this is not a binding platform. But yeah, okay, let's call it withdrawal. So that was the first step of this policy. And that did not draw that much of China's criticism. I mean, yeah, we had a Global Times article here and there. But of course, this wasn't the trigger point. The trigger point was specifically what you mentioned, the second part of the Lithuanian policy, which was increasing, basically falling back on what they call democratic partners in East Asia including Taiwan. So this was not specifically Taiwan tailored, but Taiwan was kind of included into this. Let's move away from autocracies. Let's try to see what we can do with developed democracies policy. And that is what triggered, of course, China's response. And that is also what triggered a change in European thinking in vis-a-vis Taiwan and the European policy.
And the European, so the Belt and Road running out of steam in Europe, for want of a better phrase, is it more political, or is it simply because the bridges and the contracts and the airports and the ports weren't getting done properly?
Let me talk about the Nordic Baltic region, and I would say that it's both. First of all, it's the fact that nothing really happened. It wasn't for the lack of trying, because the initial period of looking for cooperation, which was started in 2012 during the 16+1, and which lasted all the way into Belt and Road Memoranda, and then a couple years after that, all the way up until 2018, I would argue, 2019 even, was all hands on deck. Let's see what we can do, how we can, work with Chinese companies logistically, and a never-ending stream of Chinese official plus business delegations in the region. Nothing came out of it, basically. Well, there were a couple of investments, right? But I think 15 million investment for one of the project that qualifies is a very small investment for FDI. A, nothing happened, and B, the geopolitical side took off.
The pushback against China's expansion which began around 2017, 2018, that pullback. I want you to stay with us. We're going to open up for questions now, but I'm going to ask a volunteer from the panelists to try to fill in the gap that has been left by some of our missing panelists, as it were, because Harsh Pant was going to talk to us about South Asia. And the situation with the Belt and Road there is, can anybody amongst us volunteer to give us a hint about what is happening with the Belt and Road in South Asia? I get silence. If I don't I'm going to demand that somebody tells us what it is. Claire, have a go at that.
Oh, I was going to talk about security and securitization along the Belt and Road. South Asia is not my area of expertise, but it is interesting to see how India is reacting and whether or not India will be a leader in the region. And I'm also curious, we're keeping an eye out on, well, I guess with South Asia, it's so diverse in terms of how the different countries, how Pakistan's relationship with China and India's relationship with China, and seeing how everything happening in Sri Lanka right now. So I think it's an incredibly important region to keep an eye out on.
Could I then sort of nail somebody down? I'm going to bring Ingrid into this one. What we've seen happen in Sri Lanka recently, it's about debt, it's about China, it's about social unrest, it's about overthrowing a president. With your deep knowledge of China, plus whatever you've read in the newspapers, give us your take.
I really also do not have the expertise to really talk about this. What I have seen in general, looking at the BRI in Asia, is that it differs so much from country to country. And if you look, for example, and also depending what's happening politically, if you look at what's happening in Myanmar, where the population is not very positive about Chinese projects, but where now the government cannot refuse Chinese projects because they need money, they need a project. So the only thing I really have looked into is the educational and the science and technology Silk Road in South Asia. And I think already mentioned during my presentation that especially in Asia, this Central Asia too, by the way, Southeast Asia, this has been quite successful. And that is because these policies were first implemented in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, and only a bit later in Africa and Latin America. So we do not have the figures there. Whereas in Southeast Asia, we do see these figures. So there, I do think also if you look at the broader impact on understanding and support for China's ideas about global governance, you do see more acceptance of these ideas in Asia. But this is very general. That's all I can say.
Thank you for that. Can I ask the panel, if we start with Una, a question from when men here is China aiming more for quantity over quality with its choice of BRI partners? Is it going for quantity over quality? Una?
I would say that I would say that probably that is not that is a false dilemma here. I would say that, of course, when it comes to, thanks for the question, by the way, when it comes to the MOU diplomacy, then of course it's quantity. How many countries can we get to sign? How many localities can we get to establish cooperation? That kind of thing. But when it comes to the projects, interestingly, when the business logic doesn't pan out, then nothing really happens. And so I would say that on the show side of things, yes, of course, it's about quantity. But on the implementation side, the business logic does kind of prevail.
Is there an example in Europe that you can give us of a quality project that has come to completion or is working well since the BRI was introduced there?
Actually, I cannot, because I'm not very good at engineering. That's why I do political science. I would say this, that what China uses as a success story, in fact, is not really a Belt and Road project, is the Pelishich Bridge. But it's very hard for me to say whether this is just being used or it indeed is successful. At least in the Nordic Baltic region, we have not seen that. We have seen a lot of for show displays.
Yeah, but you haven't seen it. Can I give that question to Claire, or when Min's question, was China aiming more for quantity over quality with its BRI partners? And can you cite for us anywhere in the world a great BRI project that's come to fruition? Claire.
Oh gosh. Okay, so I agree with Una that this is a false dilemma. I would say that China is interested in securing at least diplomatic partners around the world. China is interested in building relationships anywhere that it can. Some of these partnerships may not be useful or strategic right now, but they could in the future. And in terms of interesting projects or big projects, I think what we're seeing happening in the South Pacific is incredibly important. We're seeing, again, a lot of policing activity there, or the promise of policing activity, which typically accompanies infrastructure projects as well. Of course, that region is strategic to not only the US, but to Australia and New Zealand. So that's really on our radar. But just to go off that really quickly too, a lot of these ports and the commercial operations surrounding ports are really interesting for us to look at strategically, because when you have a port and you have Chinese container companies going, a lot of the times they have armed maritime escorts, and those armed maritime escorts provided by private security companies, they serve, again, other functions as well, or they're able to. A lot of times some of these companies, as Costco Shipping, China's largest freight shipping company, also has its own maritime militia that can ostensibly work with PLA Navy on non-combatant evacuation operations or on refueling and supply logistics operations. So I think at large, ports, the shipping, maritime trade industry is really important in terms of where China has built up not only really commercial presence, but also potential military and security presence as well.
And they are actually building those ports, aren't they? I mean, the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka has actually been built and is working, isn't it?
Yeah. And in addition to building ports, I mean, we're talking about financing ports, we're talking about ownership stakes in ports, management operations in ports, and then not just the ports themselves and the terminals, but also the cities around them. They're building Gwadar and Djibouti, I believe, are smart cities or smart ports. So we're also talking about 5G and about all the other infrastructure that comes along with such a.
And this is, as you were saying, this is still ongoing. I mean, nothing is stopping this expansion of the Belt and Road happening at the moment, despite the gloom stories we're getting out of China of the economy and the COVID crackdown and companies moving out, the Belt and Road is still under full steam?
Yeah, I don't know if full steam is maybe the ideal way to characterize it, because it really does vary by region and does vary by industry. But broadly, I think China has such extensive reach, really critical industries, really critical infrastructure. And I think some of these headlines do a disservice, because people think that it's over or we don't have to worry anymore. China is backing down, there's too much debt. But the reality is China is already there, and we kind of just have to see what's next and be able to compete.
Can we have another question here, which I'm going to ask the whole panel. I'm going to give it to Claire, but chip in anybody if you disagree with her, particularly, because we like debate. Ajay Pratap Singh Rathore, the West has done Build Back Better World, Global Gateway, Blue Dot Initiative, and PGII to try to counter BRI. Would it be better to work with China on global infrastructure investment rather than against it? Claire, would it be better?
I think it's a tough question to answer, and this is my own personal opinion. I think it is. We do have to find a way to work together, especially in countries where China and the US both have interests. We can't ask every country to make a hard choice. It's not a zero-sum game. We do have to figure out in terms of financing where we can support a lot of our partner countries in benefiting from Chinese infrastructure investments, but also be able to guard against any potential risks. So I think it's important to think about cooperation in these spaces and not only competition.
So where does the Asia Investment Infrastructure Bank fit into all this? Because this is a Chinese sort of based bank that is meant to do all this cooperation stuff, isn't it?
It is. And at least when I look at the Belt and Road Initiative, I do consider it to be a Chinese entity. I know that not everybody does, but a lot of the multilateral development banks a lot of them have not sanctioned, but they blacklisted Chinese companies for issues like corruption or non-competition with tendering. The AIIB is not party to that multilateral, I think it's like multi-debarment clause, in which if the World Bank debars a Chinese company like CCCC, then the African Development Bank will as well. And so the AIIB does, I think, operate in a bit of the special capacity there.
Okay, thank you. No, that's really expanding the argument. Hey, Ingrid tells us that she has got examples of successful projects in Europe. Tell us, Ingrid.
Well, actually, Claire already referred to port activities. I think China's investment and activities in European ports, not only Piraeus, that's a very well-known example, but also ports in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and even Belgium, are quite successful. Another thing that keeps on developing are the train connections. They are growing very silently, but I regularly read of reports of a new connection being established and more trains being added, and these trains becoming longer and better filled with higher added value products. So it's maybe a small element, but these are examples of ongoing projects. So there is the rhetoric in Europe against BRI, but then on the ground things are just taking place and developing.
So these are Belt and Road Initiative projects that are continuing to develop in Europe. Could you give us what has evolved in the past few years actually is this concept of critical infrastructure, and that China could invest in this sort of thing, but it can't invest in that sort of thing. Is that clear now in the European Union or in Europe as to what China can be allowed to invest in and what it can't be? Ingrid?
Well, maybe Una knows even better, but these EU rules are not binding at the EU level. So countries are invited to translate them to their national context and then maybe at the national level make them binding. But at the European level, they are not. So this means that some countries, for example, my own country, Netherlands, is developing these rules and making them binding. So I think right now it will be very difficult for Chinese company, I think impossible actually to invest in critical infrastructure.
Yes,
sometimes China is finding ways around this, but at least the rules are there. But that's not true for every EU country.
We had a situation here whereby Boris Johnson, in the final days of his premiership, has given the go-ahead to for the government to put in, I think it's $30 billion or pounds, to a nuclear power project in Sizewell on the Suffolk coast, because that was going to be done by China. But it's now not acceptable to have China in that project politically, and so that's not happening. Una, got any things to say?
I just wanted to latch on to Ingrid's point about this EU not these regulations not being binding. Yes, we do. We fall back on two things, I think. Ironically, none of them is EU. The first thing are national legislations where they're mostly actor agnostic and investment screening mechanisms. Some countries have adapted them, including my region, in thinking of Russian money. Others are adapting them thinking about Chinese investment, possible technology transfer, but they are mostly actor agnostic. The other big instrument, of course, is NATO signaling. So it is, and that was the case with the Lithuanian port of Klaipėda. It is a NATO port. So when the Chinese approached with an idea to obtain a majority stake, of course, absolutely clearly the reaction was no. So perhaps, and this perhaps holds also some sort of an implication for the EU, is that it will not be able in how the situation is developing to fall back on these two non-EU mechanisms.
Okay, thank you for that. We are now going to get to broaden out a bit on this next question from Sunil Grung. What are the panel's thoughts on the Belt and Road's environmental implications for recipient countries' ecosystems and biodiversity? Claire. Are you muted? We can't hear you.
I'm sorry. All right, you can hear me now. This is not my area of expertise, but we do come across, and my team does come across so many examples of not just environmental crises or environmental challenges posed by China, but also situations where China is using force to dispel protesters and to clear the ground when these issues do arise. For example, in Cambodia, there were reports that a big Chinese developer had used or invoked the Cambodian military to clear out protesters when along, I think it was the Dhaka Sakor, as a coastline project. And so I think this is an area where you see the partner countries' interests, the Chinese interest, commercial interest, profitability, really clashing with environmental concerns. And it is troubling to see some of these trends.
Okay. And so it's the. I mean, if you're doing if a sort of Western-led infrastructure building project comes along, the Chinese-led one, is the environmental issues going to be better on the Western-led one necessarily?
I'm not sure, but I think there is more transparency, and a lot of Western actors are more beholden for various reasons to environmental stakeholders and to certain investor concerns. We don't always see that with Chinese companies, especially state-led ones.
Yeah, the transparency is the key thing there, isn't it? Ingrid, any thoughts on that? The environment, ecosystems, biodiversity?
I fully agree with Claire that this is really still a problem. China is aware that this is an obstacle to promoting BRI and BRI projects. And there is some research that suggests that China is improving in this area. So there are not really figures, but there is an increase in projects where the environment, biodiversity is taken into account. And it's also something that is very clearly promoted by the Chinese government. But for example, private Chinese companies do not always pay attention to government policies in that respect. So that's only one of the problems. Yeah. So this is still something that needs a lot of attention. Yes, not only environmental projects, but also benefits for local communities. That's a related one.
Yes, of course, and the transparency issue is a big one. Una, any thoughts on that?
I would just like to add that this exact argument is something that has pushed some of my Chinese colleagues to argue for like a green, clean, and lean Belt and Road almost, right? So to concentrate not on these groundbreaking, let's run a river across the desert projects that have crazy impact on the environment, but rather, let's see if we can, be of service here and there, not exactly with existing technology. So these scientists, including Chen Xiangming, are talking about, let's tone down the showing off and let's maybe increase the story of where we've helped smaller communities. Right. I don't know how much does that translate into realities on the ground, but I would say that from a perspective of PR, perhaps that's a good call.
Yeah, it's a hearts and minds issue as well, isn't it? Once you start doing it, I want to bring in Andrew KP Lung's question now, which takes us into two areas. One we've mentioned, the other one we haven't. Could the panel tell us a bit more about the digital Silk Road and the Arctic Silk Road, including the implications? Ingrid, I think you mentioned the digital Silk Road, didn't you?
Yeah.
So tell us, you can start us off on this then.
What I've seen so far in research, and it's not my area of expertise, is that China is investing enormously in building this digital Silk Road, and that it's making great progress, especially in Asia, Central Asia, by building digital stations that connect them with Chinese digital systems. And putting Chinese standards in these systems. So I think this is an area that needs far more attention. China is doing it rather quietly. And I think this is also a risk for the future, and also for the standardization in digital technologies.
Just give us an idea for laymen like myself, what is this equipment and what does it do?
Well, I'm not a technical expert at all, but it is that, let's see, programs, but also technical parts, that they all fit together.
Okay.
For example,
mobile phones and Wi-Fi and all that sort of thing, all fits together, so that your social media platforms and all of that.
Exactly, but also then the technical parts, and this is of course a very simplistic view on this from a non-technical expert, but that maybe gives you an idea.
Yeah, but politically, it's important, isn't it? Because it brings that community under. I mean, we had here in Britain, we had the Huawei issue, and we still have it on our 5G networks. Anything on the Arctic Silk Road? We have a hand up. Not you, Ingrid. Anything on the Arctic Silk Road? Una?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's obviously the Polar Silk Road and the Arctic development is in the 5-year plan now, and China came up with a white paper in 2018 stressing that it's a near Arctic state. But I would like to approach this from a perspective of China-Russia relationship. And of course, and this is again, in my opinion, which is a refrain of Belt and Road, a disconnect between words and deeds. In the signaling realm, Russia and China is kind of pushing towards this Arctic cooperation. And Russia has in fact also acknowledged, interestingly, very sober document for Russia, to be honest, that its Arctic regions are in fact very underdeveloped economically, socially, environmentally. So Russia's been overplaying the security aspect for decades. And so, of course, for China, any other country within the Arctic Council, apart from Russia, is kind of a consolation prize. But in order for the Arctic Silk Road to be operational, it needs Russia's support. But in words, Russia is in support of that. But in deeds, in fact, Russia is very much afraid and demonstrates constraint and outward hostility towards China as the strong, aggressive partner. So we will see, but I would always divide the loud success stories by 2, at least.
And we've got on the Arctic Silk Road, we've got the climate situation and the shipping now able to go through there. And China is taking a lead in that, a technical lead in that, isn't it, in designing tankers and ships that can get through it. Is that right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and so is this going to become? I mean, somebody described to me once that the opening up of the Arctic sea routes is in the comparison to the discovery of oil in the Middle East, in the way that it's going to create a new geopolitical situation. Does anybody disagree? Claire, do you disagree or agree with that?
So the Arctic is also not my specific area, but I'm happy to speak a bit more on the digital Silk Road.
Okay.
So I can kind of swerve back that way.
All right, then that's fine.
What I think is interesting is, like a lot of other Belt and Road related extensions, the digital Silk Road, it was officially introduced in 2017, but it was already used in internal rhetoric since 2015. And as really a policy, it has existed for at least 2 decades in China. So starting in 2000, China was awarded a contract to lay fiber optic cables in Cuba. It has been doing the same for, again, really a long time. It's not brand new. And one of the key elements of the digital Silk Road, the key features, is that it's presented as a commercial opportunity to bridge the global digital divide. And it serves as a vehicle for Chinese tech champions like Huawei, ZTE, Alibaba, and Tencent to go overseas. And so that allows China to also create interdependencies between its overseas projects. Its Huawei projects here and there, and its fiber submarine cables here and there end up being connected. This kind of goes back to my earlier point about interconnection, is that this is really important for China to be able to link even power grids across the world. China has a global energy interconnection, and the idea is to use Chinese technology to bridge not just power substations and grids, but also smart meters and increasingly digitized power infrastructure overseas. So I think it's a really interesting conversation, and it taps into, again, everything from consumer to military electronics.
So the Huawei issue, which came up from the US and for us and that sort of, that is part of the digital Silk Road, was it? Huawei wanting, or us wanting Huawei originally to build our 5G network until it was stopped. Is that the digital Silk Road?
I think, like a lot of other Belt and Road aspects of the Belt and Road and all Belt and Road extensions, the Belt and Road is everything and nothing at the same time. So, like, yes, you could absolutely say Huawei, everything Huawei does is a part of the Belt and Road. Other people might not agree with you. Even the State Council can't really agree on one definition of the Belt and Road. I would say broadly, yes, because I personally consider all Chinese economic activity overseas, led by Chinese-backed actors, to be really Belt and Road. And with Huawei too, Huawei isn't really backing down. We're seeing huge expansion in the Middle East and Middle East, North Africa right now. There's really been a big boom in activity, encouraged by geopolitical events. And we're seeing Huawei do a really good job of not just going and pitching projects, but partnering with national strategies like Egypt's Vision 2030, Saudi Vision 2030, UAE, for example, and really getting in there and aligning itself with national strategic goals, which kind of gives Huawei and its projects longevity.
Okay, this is fascinating, because we began the debate here talking about the infrastructure, which is how most of us think about that, but we've now gone into education, science, technology, the teaching, and now we've sort of, through Andrew KP Lung's question, gone into the digital Silk Road, which seems huge. And I just want to ask, before we move off this, in his question, he put the digital Silk Road with the Arctic Silk Road. Barry Gardner reminded me in the private chat that China has proclaimed itself to be a near Arctic state. And then there's those shipping routes between Shanghai and Rotterdam and whatever we were talking about. But would the panel think that the digital Silk Road is far more crucial and critical to know about or to do than the Arctic Silk Road, or are they on an equal footing? Ingrid.
I think in the near future, in the near term, digital Silk Road is far more important, because it has so many implications and is so important for, well, global development and development of our economies. And China is developing these digital technologies very rapidly. It's also investing a lot of money, also a lot of S&T money in this area. So I think this is far more important. But if in the future the northern route would become really available and viable, I think this will, for China's expansion of exports and connections, be crucial, because it shortens the time, of course, of the shipping lane enormously. And indeed, a couple of years ago, the first Chinese ship, or the first commercial ship that crossed that route was a Chinese one coming to Rotterdam. Yeah.
Yes, it was. And I think that the Chinese wanted to build a railroad from Kirkenes, which is the first port that you get to after Russia in Western Europe, down to get those goods into the European rail system. And that would have cut off several more days before getting to Rotterdam. But they were blocked. The Norwegians blocked that from happening. We have time for one more question from Amit Rana. Since Belt and Road partners are likely to change their attitudes towards the project according to changes in their domestic situations, how right, as well as shifts in the international landscape, what might the wider impact be of this, the changing attitudes? Claire? Claire?
Moment. A little frozen over there.
You're frozen. Are you with us?
I think we're back.
Did you hear the question?
Do you mind popping back on the screen for a second?
Yeah. It's about changing landscapes, and as they did, because they've changed in Britain, they've changed in Europe. So what could be the wider impact?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the long-term impacts is some of these projects that China is involved in are very long-term. I mentioned earlier the difficulty of rip and replace. You know, if a Chinese company like Huawei has come in and has run 5G trials, and your telecommunications infrastructure is based on Chinese equipment, even if the ruling party or the governing party changes their mind, or political shifts happen, it is still really difficult to change providers and to move on to or to, I guess, reshore some of that equipment. So ultimately, I think the impact, I can't speak on the impact. I think perhaps Una or Ingrid could from a European perspective. But a lot of the projects that we're looking at, China is doing it strategically. They're using, again, technical standards and equipment to really ingrain their companies and their technologies into new regions and into new markets for a very long time.
That's it. Well, Una, any thoughts on that?
Yes, just to say that one of my initial remarks was that China was trying to bridge the gap between, itself and the Western orientation, and it failed at that. And I think the fact that the many nations that consider themselves to be part of the Western camp stopped short from entering this rip and replace trap that Claire just described. But other nations that do not necessarily align with the West did subscribe to this, actually ends up doing the opposite of what China had set out to do.
It's. I just want to, before we go to Barry Gardner, to sum up this. It's been fascinating. I want to ask Ingrid and Una a personal question, because we've talked about the education and Chinese education coming to various parts of the world, and us in the West clamping down on that element. But both of you studied at the Shanghai Fudan University. Do you feel that you have sort of been instilled with any Chinese values, Chinese way of thinking, that you understand the whole thing better? And is that what would be happening to the Chinese students that come here? Una.
I will tell you one better. I actually studied on a Chinese government scholarship, so I guess that.
There we are. So are you beholden?
I do have to say that, of course, even though I was actually quite lucky, because I was doing kind of a weird postdoc at Fudan, and I was able to attend lectures, and that was at the School of Philosophy, and I was able to attend classes together with Chinese students. And many students who study in China don't have that opportunity because they kind of just study the language and mix within themselves. So of course, yes, you do get to know the environment better. Whether that makes you a China apologist, no, I disagree with that. But it does put you sometimes in a position where you have to explain some of the logic, and that brings fire on you. But of course, and I'm very sad to know that this window has closed in a lot of ways. So we already don't have enough expertise, and I wonder how will we be able to make up for that expertise in the future. That's an issue.
Ingrid, what did you take away from it, and what do you think Chinese students that study in Europe take away from their sessions here?
Well, what I took away, I studied there in the mid-'80s, so a long time ago. But after that, I lived another 7 years in China over the various decades. And well, I do not subscribe to the Chinese values. I still treasure my own European values. But you do get a better understanding of the Chinese perspective, the Chinese thinking. The way why China is developing certain policies and also implementing the way they implement them. So it's more the possibility or the knowledge to analyze and interpret Chinese policies that you take away from studying there. If you look at the other way around, we always thought and maybe also hoped that Chinese students would then embrace our democratic systems and values and take that back home. And that only happens and happened to a small extent, maybe a bit more, let's say 20 years ago. But currently we do see from the figures that the majority of students want to return to China, do return to China, that they that they like the lives they can lead here, there's more freedom, they do acknowledge that. But in the end, it doesn't mean they also see the flaws in our system. So when they return back, they're also very happy to be back, and they also discuss, let's say, what they see as positive aspects of the Chinese system. What is unfortunate is right now they do not feel free to openly discuss it. It would be very interesting to discuss with them, well, our systems and what this brings. But that is not possible because Chinese students do no longer feel free to openly discuss political issues, neither in China but also not when they are abroad.
Claire, you started us off with the debate superbly. Just give us your final thoughts, particularly on that, cross-educational element. I don't know where you've studied, but give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, if we, and by we mean if the United States, for example, really wants to be competitive with China, we really have to think about human capital. And development isn't possible without human capital. It isn't possible without rural infrastructure and connectivity. And these are some of the things that China has done best, in my opinion. And so again, if we want to compete in terms of industrial hubs and ports, if we want to compete in terms of telecoms infrastructure, we have to think about the people first.
Yeah, no, that's and this Ingrid mentioned China apologists, and we're hearing this a lot more in Britain now as the polarization happens. That's far too simplistic when you're discussing China, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I think a lot of the students that are going to China, a lot of the companies are working with China. A lot of the countries are receptive to Chinese investment. It's not zero sum. It's not if you're pro-China or anti-China. Sometimes the incentives are really strong, and sometimes the reward is great, and there aren't sustainable alternatives. And I don't think it's fair to paint a country one way or another. I think there's always room for cooperation, at least from the U.S. and from U.S. allies, and there's no reason to, I guess, disengage with the country because China already has a presence there.
Thank you very much. It is time now to go to Barry Gardner, who has lived and breathed the China and the Belt and Road Initiative for many years from his perch at the center of British democracy. And he also has a fine point to make about the Arctic and the digital Silk Roads. So over to you, Barry. What did you make of our debate?
Look, can I just say thank you? And I think it's actually been helpful that we were one less speaker, because the quality of the discussion afterwards has been really stunning. The point I wanted to make about this choice between which is more important, the digital or the Arctic Silk Road, I simply said in the chat to you, Humphrey, that this was like in 1905 posing the question, which is more important, the Panama Canal or the telephone? You know, they both are, is the answer. I want to, in what time is left, I want to first of all sketchily go over what each of our contributors has said, and then try and put it in a context of my own view on the matter. Charles began by saying, look, the BRI is facing a reappraisal. It's the world's largest lender of development finance. The loans issued in recent years have turned bad, he said. Many programs face problems. And he identified three of those: lack of transparency, insufficient risk management, and the involvement of many of the world's poorest nations, meaning that the capacity wasn't there. Claire, I moved on to say, well, look, she agreed with, and Claire, can I just say, I admire anybody who can talk faster than I can think. I was really struggling to keep pace with you there. But you seem to agree with the problems that Charles had identified, but said that the BRI had achieved a lot of its intended purposes. The Chinese companies that had developed trade, the ports and infrastructure presence that they now had around the globe. But of course, you also pointed out that it now needed to secure those strategic benefits. I liked your phrase that it was great branding, but perhaps not novel initiative. And you spoke of how China was changing its hype to be less threatening and more development oriented. And I thought that was significant, and we'll pick up on that later. And really, I felt your conclusion was, look, the BRI is evolving, it's not declining. Ingrid, the academic Silk Road, now a key project for President Xi, you said. It's helpful in furthering China's policy for global governance. Again, 3 points from you: strengthen the science and technology collaboration is part of what's going on. You spoke of the cultivation and training of talent in BRI countries, building that supply side of the economy, and we touched again upon that in the final part of the discussion just there a moment ago, and how important that supply side, those skills, that training is for the required labor for those infrastructure projects in those countries. And you spoke of the cultural collaboration, the Confucius Institutes, and the way in which that was advancing. Perhaps the most important phrase that I thought came out of all of the contributions was from you, and that was, this is a long-term vision. And I thought it was really salutary that you reminded us, you know, hey guys, this has been going for less than a decade, and China doesn't think in short term, it thinks in long term. I thought that was really, really important. You posed a question as to whether the BRI countries experienced academic benefits. You spoke about the quality of publications, but then you said, no, it may not have done that. But of course, we're talking about some of the poorest, least developed countries in the world, and they're not at the forefront of academic excellence, and perhaps that shouldn't be so surprising. But you also spoke about the politicization of science and technological collaboration and the fears that was generating. Bērziņa-Čerenkova, she built this picture of the European perspective, I think very much from a Baltic and Nordic perspective. and said, look, we tried, but it never really got off the ground. There was enthusiasm between 2013, 2016, 17, but actually the projects didn't really materialize. It didn't seem to work for us. And then, of course, the political perspective really took over. Now, from a UK point of view, I think it's really interesting that we went through that very period of sweetheart relationship. This was the new golden relationship when we had our prime minister then. It's so long, so many prime ministers ago, I can hardly remember. David Cameron, I believe it was, and George Osborne, who foresaw this golden era of opportunity with China. And very quickly, that gave way to a much more skeptical view that Theresa May brought in, and then really a very antagonistic view that Humphrey was mentioning when he talked about the Huawei and the involvement of China within nuclear projects within the UK. So these are the sort of the sweep of our conversation. The common view has been that the BRI supports China's foreign policy and aims to grow China's economic, its political power abroad. But I think it should be seen as a means to build the Chinese domestic state, the Chinese domestic economy. The BRI does that through creating conditions for China to build a high technology economy at home, redistribute economic growth within China, and it does that by securing China's trade routes and access to key commodities overseas. It promotes China's domestic manufacturing capabilities, for example, through the digital Silk Road, and it promotes its information, its communications technology, its supply chain, its hardware, the optical cable and satellite network. The BRI isn't only about infrastructure and manufacturing, and that was, I think Ingrid really brought that out. It also emphasizes economic policy coordination, trade and investment facilitation, dispute settlement, tourism, student and personnel exchanges, and cooperation in R&D, in standards, in media, in health. And whilst there's an overarching brand for these investments and broad policy goals that join them up, there isn't always clear policy coordination and connectivity between the different strands of the BRI. And Claire, you said that perfectly at the end. When I can't remember the phrase that you used, but I should have written it down at the time. But you really encapsulated that at the end. There also appears to be tensions, I think, between different branches of government. China's military and its state-owned enterprises don't always agree about the direction of the initiative. So what does the BRI mean for the foreign and defense policy of China? Chinese officials have been keen lately to challenge the idea that the BRI is a foreign policy tool to increase its influence. And in August 2018, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, said that BRI was neither a Marshall Plan nor a geostrategic concept. And he said it was better described as an attempt to build a community with a shared future together with other countries around the globe. Now, it was the same year that President Xi also characterized it as an economic cooperation initiative, not a geopolitical or military alliance. And that feeds very well, I think, with what you were saying, Ingrid, about the way in which they wanted to tone down this sense that there was a threat here. It's important to have a hard-nosed understanding, though, I think, of the extent to which China's economic investments align with its military and security objectives. Its significant investments abroad, the size of its economy, actually, yes, they've given it much more global influence. But China is very unlikely to allow its interests abroad to be put in jeopardy. It now has those strategic interests. It now has those infrastructure claims, and it will develop the military capacity to enforce those claims and the rights that it perceives it has as a result of those. And I think we have to be, from a defense point of view, from a strategic point of view, we have to be savvy to that. Let's look at public opinion in other parts of the world. In 2019, the Pew Research Center surveyed perceptions of China. I think it was in 16 countries. And it looked at perceptions of Chinese investment, China's growing economy, and they were broadly seen as positive in those 16 countries. If you look at Africa, Nigerians, I think, were the most positive about China's economic investment. 83% saying China's growing economy was a good thing. 84% in Nigeria saying that investment from China was beneficial and a good thing. If you go to Kenya, on the other side of Africa, there was less enthusiasm, but hey, still scores of 68 and 60% in favor of Chinese economy and investment. South Africa, the same, 64 and 59%. Tunisians in the north, 66 and 69%. So in Africa, it's a very different picture of how people look at Chinese investment. There was greater skepticism amongst the two Southeast Asian countries that Pew surveyed. In the Philippines, I think it was 48% said China's economy was a bad thing, versus 47% who said it was a good thing, and presumably 5% who just didn't know. Investment from China was seen slightly more negatively, with 49% saying it was a bad thing and 45% saying it was a good thing. So, you know, there really is a very different view in the rest of the world to the European or the United States view. And it's important that we understand that. The Mercator Institute published a series of papers just earlier this month on several countries' perspectives on China. They included Indonesia, Kenya, and Nigeria. And those provide insights into those countries' relations with China in terms of economics, security, and the BRI. And in Indonesia, the Merrick's report talked about growing concerns about some elements of its economic relationship with China, but also emphasized that Indonesia's ethnic Chinese population makes the perspective there much more complex when trying to understand what the public feeling is. It said there are growing concerns amongst the Indonesian public about the influx of Chinese goods and migrant laborers, and about Indonesia's inability to seize business opportunities in China's market. The biggest Chinese investment project, the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway, that's become controversial because of project delays and cost overruns. But it emphasized that Chinese Indonesians are the main actors in economic relations between the two countries and the ones who have benefited most from the relationship. And resentment of Chinese investment on perceived unequal terms also means that the Chinese diaspora can generate domestic political frictions in identity politics in Indonesia. So it also looked at Kenya. The report there emphasized that whilst Chinese investment has eclipsed investment from the West, Kenya has embraced Chinese BRI because it comes with fewer strings attached. It still remains open to Western investment, but it hopes that that flexible positioning will benefit the country from a Kenyan point of view. China's growing economic power, heightened engagement in Africa, the geostrategic importance of anchor states like Kenya. In the early 2000s, Kenya's foreign assistance came from the West. It was approximately $750 million. China's presence means that Kenya has been able to diversify its sources of development assistance. And by 2018, Chinese loans in Kenya alone stood at 4.75 billion. That's the difference that it's made. And that has come with many less strings attached, strings which we in the West pegged to governance issues and Again, here lies a problem, and it's one of the problems that Charles identified right at the beginning, that lack of transparency and insufficient risk management, all those governance questions. So I don't want to go on too much about the rest of the world and the way it sees Africa, but the report on Nigeria puts Chinese investment in the country right in that context of Nigeria's economic and political problems. They really welcome the injection of finance from Beijing because Nigeria's got the largest population, the biggest economy in Africa, but it's got huge challenges. 80 million of Nigeria's 200 million people live in poverty. There is insufficient infrastructure. There are weak and ineffective institutions. There are transparency and governance issues. And of course, they have the problem of the insurgency in the Northeast. So China, as a major investor, an alternative to other sources of development finance like the IMF or the World Bank, it has become Nigeria's largest bilateral lender. And you know, when Ingrid was talking about long-term vision, you know, I just think, why has the West been completely incapable of developing that long-term vision and getting the same sort of traction in those countries? It's not only about lack of imposition of governance criteria. We simply have not come up to the mark here. And I think we really do need to do a lot of serious thinking about the way in which we approach this. I want to briefly, there's only a few minutes remaining, but I want to touch on debt trap diplomacy, because our Commons Affairs Select Committee in Parliament, and in fact the head of the UK intelligence agency, MI6, have warned both of them of the potential debt traps that could put countries into a state of dependency with China. A couple of years ago, the committee said there's a risk that the promise of Chinese investment or the coercive leverage of indebtedness to China could encourage countries to join Chinese efforts to undermine certain aspects of the rules-based international system and could weaken alliances and partnerships. So while that can be a consequence of Chinese investment and its lending to BRI partner countries, it's not to say that that is necessarily its purpose, but we have to be aware of it. The BRI investments serve to build its domestic capacity, and assets that can't be built or continue to be in service are not actually, you know, in partner countries, are not going to work to China's strategic domestic aims. Chatham House did an analysis of the debt trap diplomacy concept, and it concluded that civil society and opposition groups in recipient countries where infrastructure projects have foundered due to indebtedness or other issues should consider where the blame lies for their failure. Because often it's seen, well, this is the fault of China. But Chatham House said the BRI is not a well-crafted Chinese plan, and recipient governments are equally or even more to blame for poorly conceived development projects. Externalizing blame only allows domestic elites in those countries to evade accountability. So in the last few years, China has had to renegotiate bilateral debt deals, often deferring payments, sometimes excluding interest payments on debts to give at least short-term relief to its debtors. And there's some evidence that China has given more favorable debt terms to those close partners, such as Pakistan, which was mentioned, when lending for BRI projects, with others having to pay commercial rates. And that is where the state-backed policy banks have come into play. That was mentioned, the China Development Bank, the China Exim Bank. And of course, they don't disclose the terms of their loans. So it makes it very difficult, well, impossible actually, to accurately assess the present value of debt owned by a country to China. Humphrey, I think I'm probably out of time. Let me just, if I can, touch on the military implications.
Off you go.
Because there's been less commentary on the military aspects of the BRI. And you can say, well, that's because it's an economic project. But I think most commentators acknowledge that part of the initiative's rationale is to increase China's prestige, its influence abroad, and shore up its domestic policy. And that enables it to invest more in its military. And the US Department of Defense, it does a report to Congress, and it has highlighted that the BRI has led to an expansion of China's military footprint abroad, which comes with risks to its reputation and security of its investments. So, you know, politically, has it been successful for China? Hey, China doesn't think in terms of 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. It thinks in terms of decades long. And I think the politics of this are, as Ingrid said, long term. So it's been a fascinating discussion. Really enjoyed listening to our experts speak on it. And you know, great to have fewer presentations and more discussion in the future, I think, because it's been really valuable.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Barry. You did actually reveal some of your frustration there at the way the Western democracies are dealing with this issue, but thank you for showing your frustration. I think the conclusion of this debate is that the Belt and Road has not lost its luster in the global arena, but we are out of time, so I can be challenged on that. We hope to get Richard Ghiasy and Harsh Pant, who couldn't be with us, back for another debate. What a lot of ground we've covered. Now read more about all these issues and much more in our sister magazine, Asian Affairs. This one, China Reality Checked and Blinkered Vision. I think that might be what Barry was talking about, where we ask difficult questions on difficult issues. Our next Democracy Forum debate is September the 22nd at the same time, 2 o'clock British time, on the fascinating question of China's Afghan agenda. That's China's Afghan agenda. Thank you, Claire Chu, Ingrid de Hoog, Una Alexandra Bērziņa-Čerenkova, and thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, for so skillfully giving us our backdrop, and Barry Gardner for your insights and conclusions. Until next month, stay involved, stay safe, and goodbye. Bye, thank you.
Oh,